Hello and welcome to Fireside with VC. My name is Andrew Romans and I'm super psyched to have Ryan Welsh, co-founder and CEO of Kyndi on the podcast. Ryan, I should disclose, is a portfolio company. We're an investor in the company, super excited about that. When I first met Ryan and he explained what Kyndi was doing, I was like, man, so this is kind of like picking up where Google leaves off. This could be a multi-trillion-dollar company if you made the right moves. And I do think of it as the kind of company where it's taking us literally from being inside the cave, like cavemen in the dark, out into the light in an age of enlightenment of how humanity should deal with whatever work and stuff that it does. So with that, Ryan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm happy to be here. This is exciting.
So Ryan, start us off with explain, what does Kyndi do?
Yeah, from a product perspective, we help enterprises get value out of their unstructured text data. So we sell a natural language technology platform to large enterprises. But to the point that you were talking about earlier about the big opportunities in front of us, from a technology perspective, what we do is we teach machines to read. And so kind of one of my founding thesis when I started the company was that I believed that by 2025, all knowledge workers would need some form of AI and machine learning enabled workflow. And the reason was because we are the bottleneck in the modern production process, because we can't read and understand information any faster than our parents or grandparents, even though we have to read more and more information. And so I believed that if we could teach machines to better understand natural language, we could amplify the productivity of humans, which could have just massive impact across countless industries.
You know, in the science fiction movies where you see like the dude is in some kind of transformer robot and there's a human inside the robot.
Yeah.
And he's able to, blast through a wall. I kind of think of it a little bit like that. So like take every person at a law firm, and you were at a law firm in 2008, going through all these documents.
Yep.
I mean, tell that story of what you were doing and how Kyndi becomes your transformer robot.
Yeah, I was working for a securities firm in New York. So my background's in applied math. I have a graduate degree in applied math, focusing on quantitative finance, and I was doing a bunch of stuff for this law firm, and I ultimately got over to the securities part of the firm during 2008, where their clients were big investment banks, and obviously 2008 was the financial crisis. There was a lot going on, and actually modeling out some of these more esoteric financial instruments were like tough for the lawyers from like a mathematical standpoint. But underlying all these instruments are thick contracts. And so the weekend that Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy, we had to reread like countless documents just to kind of understand exposure. Who are counterparties? What are the obligations? Because these things can be tweaked because they're over-the-counter instruments. And so essentially over like a 2.5-3 day period, I had to try to read an amount of information that when I left for business school 3 years later, I was still reading.
Yeah.
And so it's like one of those stories where you talk to people and there's countless stories like that, where it's just like, hey, there's so much information that I have to read through that I can never get on top of it, whether it's working in law firms or even working in finance and you're doing research and you're actually trying to like get a handle on a certain marketplace. If you're doing competitive intelligence internally at a manufacturing company, I mean, we see this over and over and over across all industries. And I really do think that, kind of this productivity point that we're seeing where we see declining productivity over the last 10-20 years, I do think that's directly related to our inability to really accelerate the understanding of this information. And so if we can offload a lot of that to machines, I mean, we're having another industrial revolution, which could again have just huge impacts.
I mean, I remember when in the legal industry there was LexisNexis. So before we had really, HTML moving into a web browser with a modern internet, let alone edge speeds of the internet to your home or office, you could go to the library or a law firm and they had LexisNexis where you could, you're trying to look for a precedent, right?
Yeah.
And so you can search the text, but what you're doing, not to get caught in like acronym soup, is that, NLP is natural language processing. So other companies will search for the word, like interest rate or whatever they were trying to pull out of
Yeah.
those 2008 documents, but you guys are doing NLP, natural language processing. Maybe so explain how that's different than like
Keyword
a
search
search
and
on
other things.
Lycos in
Yeah.
the old days.
Term-based search is the classic search that everyone's familiar with. And so we've been, introduced to this system where I can type in keywords and it goes and finds those keywords in documents, brings back URLs, and you can click through it. And there's obviously different ranking algorithms that you can use, and everyone's very familiar with this. What's interesting with language and actually understanding language is that language has three components to it. It has syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And so it has the structure of the language, it has the meaning, the semantics of it, and then it has the intended meaning, the pragmatics of the communicator. And so what's interesting is actually getting a machine to understand what a person is saying is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And so if you can build software that better understands context, meaning, and all of that, you can then enable a system to understand natural language questions, and then take those natural language questions and find the snippet of text within the underlying documents that contain the answer. I always kind of think about search as this spectrum where you're constantly trying to get to the smallest subset of meaningful information as fast as possible. And by definition, the smallest subset of meaningful information is the answer, right? On one end of the spectrum, you have all the information that you can search. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the answer. And this evolution that we've seen is we're getting closer and closer and closer to our ability to ask any question and get the answer. And so I think term-based search was a major leap forward from I have all this stuff to look through to now I can get to a smaller subset than this huge data repository. But then I think, NLP, and specifically the task of question answering or natural language search, which within the field of natural language processing, is another giant leap forward beyond term search, where users can start to ask natural language questions and not be steered to a 300-page document that you then need to read through to find the answer, but
Right.
to actually steer to the sentence within that 300-page document that likely contains your answer. And the acceleration that you see in workflows and other types of things is just tremendous.
So like, to give a specific example, like, I'm in my car, I realize the oil needs to be changed. I open the glove box and get out a manual, look through it of what kind of oil does it take. Is that an example, or is that too simplistic?
That's a great example. I mean, we see this constantly, and actually kind of customer support is a big use case across several industries. And it could be internal. So employees looking for answers to questions on how to operate machinery, or it can be external. I bought a car and I'm now trying to figure out what oil to put in it. And so a lot of times we'll see companies have to field these questions if people can't actually find the answer to their question. And so with these types of systems, yes, you would be able to ask, hey, what type of oil should I put in my car? It's October and the weather is now an average temperature of 55 degrees here in Northern California, right? Because there's different types of oil that you may want to put in your car for that type. And you'd be able to be steered directly to the sentence that contains your answer. And I talk about being steered to the sentence that contains your answer because there's other methods of natural language processing where the system will spit out the answer. So it may say like 10W30. Right. And you go, well, why is that the right answer? Because you want to confirm that it's the right answer. And a lot of times systems will not be able to point you to the text that has maybe some context around why that's the right answer, so you can confirm it's the answer. And so at Kyndi, we constantly are steering people to the snippet of text that contains the answer versus just kind of blurting out something that people can't confirm for themselves.
And you've built a lot of technology that not every company can catch up with overnight. How much funding have you raised to date? for our
Yeah, we've
listeners?
done 43 million in funding. So our early investors in the seed and the A was Tim Connors of Pivot North, who's just been an incredible investor. Some of his LPs participated in those rounds as well. Daniel Darling from Darling Ventures was early. Then Intel Capital led our Series B.
Daniel was the one who brought us in. That was
right.
I was trying to remember where it came from, but now you said that, yeah. So that's a lot of money to raise, and you're still going. Explain some of the stuff you're doing that others are not. For example, sometimes in just in the Unix world, people are like, "Oh, we're part of the AT&T Unix, we're part of the Berkeley Unix," and they almost started to hate each other, or at least they didn't believe that the other was right. I'm just letting my dog into my little home office here. And within the AI world, and going down to how, these AI engineers with their big salaries, they tend to fall into different camps. You've sort of fused, I think, two different camps. And we talk about that.
Yeah, that's a funny thing that I observed getting into the industry. And so I was lucky enough to found this company with some pioneers in the field of AI, academics who are still professors. One gentleman was a fellow for the Association for the Advancement of AI. So people that have been in the game for decades. And the one thing I liked about this group was it really didn't matter what style of AI you were trying to use. And I'll touch on the different styles in a second. It was what was the right technique for the problem you're trying to solve. And so over the last, 70, 80 years, since the field of AI was kind of like brought as an academic discipline, we've seen different types of AI. And so there's been machine learning, which is super hot right now. And then there's been symbolic AI, there's Bayesian techniques, there's all different types of techniques to do all the different types of intelligence that people have. With machine learning, it's the ability to learn. With symbolic AI, it's the ability to reason. And what was really fascinating when I started to observe is that if you're in one camp, you actually kind of hate the other camp, which is like really, really fascinating. And you can kind of, if you look at it, like go look at debates between Gary Marcus and Jan LeCun, Gary Marcus and Joshua Bengio. Go see anytime that Jeff Hinton is at a conference, go see his comments. And Jan LeCun, Joshua Bengio, and Jeff Hinton being the godfathers of deep learning. And then Gary Marcus being kind of more on he loves deep learning, but more on the symbolic side, says that some of that needs to be layered in. And what's interesting is these people just throw grenades at each other all day long. And I think it comes down to the funding and different things that were, being doled out back in the day. But what we thought about at Kyndi is when you actually evaluated the different styles of AI, what you saw was that a lot of the problems with one technique were overcome with the strengths of an alternative technique.
Sure.
And so when we saw that, it was like, okay, how do we bring these things together? And we're not the first to think about how we bring these things together. What we are one of the first to do is actually bring them together and in a non-superficial way, like a really deep, tight coupling of machine learning and symbolic artificial intelligence. And it's a field called neurosymbolic. And we were actually just recognized by the World Economic Forum as being a technology pioneer this year, specifically for our pioneering this field of neurosymbolic AI.
Yeah, well, I think it's actually like, if you think of yourself as a Silicon Valley leader or wherever globally the Silicon Valley is right now, to be able to manage these egos and these personalities and have them feel like they're self-actualizing working with you at your company as opposed to everywhere else they're getting recruited. That's another thing, just retaining someone in this kind of business when they're so sought after by other well-funded companies is a challenge. So I kind of tip my hat that you've been able to be like, hey, listen, the farmers and whatever the hunters can get along, or whatever that is,
Yeah.
the farmers and the herders can get along. And look, in finance, you've got discounted cash flow, you have comparables,
Yeah.
you've got direct negotiation with your access to corp dev who's ready to buy the company
Yep.
to help come to a consensus on a share price. Going with one methodology alone, is maybe not the smartest thing, ever, but not so easy to pull off. So I think that's impressive.
Yeah. And
Go ahead.
what's interesting about that real quick is one thing we filter for pretty, we really look for this is, are people open-minded to use different techniques to solve the problem? Because as a business, what we're trying to do is deliver value to customers ultimately. And I think a lot of people in the AI space, they have a technique that they know and love, and they think it solves all problems.
And that's a little like invented here.
Yeah. And so when we, look for folks, PhDs to join us, it's, are you willing to step outside of your comfort zone, right? If you have a PhD in deep learning, are you willing to start understanding like knowledge representations in the symbolic field, and like vice versa? And it really is that like customer obsession and using the right techniques for the problem that you're trying to solve, versus what we see over and over and over is just, I have a hammer and everything's a nail, right? And we're trying to solve all problems with one technique.
Well, if you're a super genius engineer, PhD in this area, and you're surrounded by these cool people in your office in San Mateo, I would think it's quite exciting to.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's helpful.
Get multidimensional. I kind of thought the first time you told me about the company of like Google is 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional, and this is like a whole nother way of understanding what you're trying to ask a set of data. But give us some concrete examples of how Kyndi is used or can be used, and feel free to talk about how it can be used, as opposed to like, because you've chosen to focus in some areas, but like, what's an example of like someone deployed it, this might be in the future, and now they're in the light as opposed to being in the cave?
No, we have folks now with deployments that use it for, and I was touching on this, customer support. So that's actually a huge one, whether it's internal or external customer support. And so a prime example is there's one group where a large, I think it's Fortune 50 or very, very large manufacturing company has all these policies and procedures that people globally have to adhere to. And when these employees are carrying out their work, they have questions about those policies and procedures. So it could be something like, hey, I need to procure this software for my company. Mm-hmm. Can I procure this software in this way, whatever way that is? Do I need a PO? Can I put it on a credit card if it's like a SaaS thing? And like just simple things like that. A lot of times, these users say, I don't recall how we're allowed to do that according to the policies and procedures that were just, updated. So let me ask a data repository. It turns out a lot of times they can't get answers to their questions. I think it's like the company that this one company we're working with, they calculated it was 30% of the questions that users ask of the system, users are able to get answers. And so 70% of their questions go unanswered. And so what they do is they then submit an IT ticket to a group of IT folks and say, hey, what's the answer to my question? And then those IT people go spend 24, 48 hours looking for the answer, and then turn around and give it back to the person. And so now you have two groups. One group of person that needs to procure software for your business that is now delayed 2 days in doing it. You have another group who probably should be doing more high value tasks than looking through a data repository for another user, now all wasting their time just looking for information. And so, here's, we see this as we've had a lot of success on targeting, internal, external customer support use case as a specific way of getting the benefits of a system like the one that we have.
I mean, so in that, you can think of like Walmart versus Kmart before Walmart destroyed Kmart.
Yeah.
If Kmart had been deploying Kyndi throughout their organization, they'd be cost savings, empowering people to be more productive. I mean, it's just no comparison. What are some other examples of, where, anybody could deploy Kyndi
Sure. So
and
we
see a
see
benefit?
it in finance as well. And so there's a lot of research that analysts do that other parts of the firm or clients may want to use. And so here's a repository that is constantly being updated with information, and people, whether it's internal investors, traders at a bank, or it's an external customer that wants to put on some trades for or invest for themselves. And so I have a question. What are the outlooks for Tesla? Right? Some analyst wrote a report on it. Turns out I can't find it, right? Or I find old reports, or I'm not searching the right way, and so the inability to actually like use and get value out of that text data. I mean, we see this across finance, we see it across manufacturing. And when I say manufacturing, we're talking about industrial manufacturing, technology manufacturing, all types of different manufacturing sectors. And then we also see it across pharma as well. And so there's constantly these data repositories that people are trying to query, and we just enable them to find the answers in a more efficient manner.
Now, everything we're talking about so far, I would think there's a large already graveyard of startups that would claim to do the same thing, or, to the untrained eye, if you just squint your eyes between Kyndi and others, they're offering the same thing.
Yes.
But when I look at how they pick up a customer and start delivering this vision as a deployment functioning reality, it seems like their tech takes 6 months to start labeling things, and it's a whole new ML starting from scratch. How's your, what do you see as are you saving 6 months time, or how does your technology behave in new environments, new data sets?
That's very astute, because it is, well, one, it is a very crowded market and everyone's saying the same thing. And so everything that I just said about our unique technology differentiation, you could probably Google, and everyone's saying the same exact thing. But
every VC says, I have that company in my portfolio.
I have that company in my portfolio as well. I got a company doing neurosymbolic as well, right? And what's really interesting is I was actually on a call with an analyst the other day. And he said to me, he goes, everything you're saying sounds exactly like what other folks are saying in the industry. And I go, great. How many of them actually do it?
Right.
And he didn't have a response.
Or even how long does it take for them to get it?
And he didn't have a response. And I think what was interesting about that was it really comes down to, I think in all enterprise software selling, is referenceability. And so if I'm going to come in, and so Kyndi takes significantly less time, because we don't require any of that label data that deep learning and other supervised machine learning.
Slow down and explain that. Slow down and explain what your competitor has to do to even begin to do what you do out of the box.
Sure. So for a question answering system, what you would do is you'd have a set of questions, then you'd have a set of answers, and you would feed them to the system so that the system can look at the text, find patterns, and see what matches up. And it's going to adjust the internal weights, and it's going to learn from the text what to, or how to answer a question when you ask that question. One of the things that's interesting in, I think, enterprise AI is enterprises don't have that label training data. And this is why you see, some of the biggest AI companies in the world today are data labeling companies. And so what you do is you'll go in, you'll collect a set of data, you'll understand what questions need to be asked of that data. You'll then either do it internally or send it externally to have someone label all of that data. And I'm talking about a lot of data and a lot of examples. And then that'll take a long period of time. And then you'll get that information back. And then once you have that training set, you can then start to train a model on that. And so I think it was Gartner that estimated from idea to deployment, on average, it takes about 9 months. And that's come down from 12 to 14 months over the last few years. And so we skipped that entire thing. And so we have an unsupervised method that allows us to ingest the raw text data and construct a a knowledge representation of that information automatically. And so we're able to ingest the data maybe in a morning, and then you can start querying it and asking natural language questions of it in the afternoon. And that's like starting fresh from our first time looking at that data. And so we're collapsing, 9 months down to a few hours, with all types of other benefits that I can speak of as well. And what's also interesting, I want to add this last thing, is we were talking to a systems integrator, and they were saying that for natural language search projects that they do, on average, it costs $250,000 just to label data.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's before you even
love that. They probably love that until they're losing clients to their competitor that's using Kyndi and jumps through that. It's like, think about like warp speed getting, Pfizer, Moderna through the pipeline.
Yeah.
And you've got very, very well-educated people interpreting clinical trial data.
Yeah.
It's like all PhDs. I mean, speak to that. I remember we're talking about you guys doing the ability to read all those kind of complicated documents, and then also be in like programmatic compliance.
Yeah, there's a few aspects of NLP, and so we're building a platform for what we call the natural language enabled enterprise. And so you touched on a few things earlier about graveyard of startups. The unstructured text problem in the enterprise has been around longer than I've been alive. And there are countless dead companies along the way. I think the technology out there has evolved to a point where we can start to solve those long-standing text problems, which is why I think there's just such a huge market opportunity. I mean, think about like 40 years of unsolved problems, and over the last 2 years, we now have technology to address them, and no one is solving them. Total like open space to go solve them. And so there's a few things that you want to do in NLP, and we ultimately want to do all of them. And so if you look at a textbook of natural language processing, there's 5 subtasks within it. And so there's speech recognition, which is like I talk into a phone and it transcribes into text. There's machine translation, which is between languages. There's text classification, which is like sentiment analysis. There's information extraction, which is like take names of people, names of companies, dates, and other things out of information. You can then like structure it because you're extracting it. And then the last one is information retrieval or natural language search. And so when we think about building this platform for the natural language enabled enterprise, since we're not IBM or Google or AWS building with a lot of cash on our balance sheet, we prioritize the rank of those tasks. And so for us right now, we focus on natural language search as the first major component of our platform, with information extraction and text classification coming next. Even though we do information extraction now, we're still kind of adjusting some things on that component. But ultimately building out this entire platform for the natural language enabled enterprise. And kind of going back to what you were saying is, yes, it's a mixture of those NLP components in a lot of ways that enables you to read, yeah. Right? Because what's, take question answering as an example. What's the best way to know if someone read a book? Ask them questions about it. Right? What's the best way to know if someone read a book? Ask them about a name or stuff like that. And so yes, our system reads it and understands it. And then you can do different things with it, whether it's trying to extract specific things out of that text or ask questions of that text. And ultimately we hope to do all of those tasks to empower enterprises globally.
And so you guys are a B2B, essentially SaaS, AI, NLP, let's give it all the buzzwords possible, company.
Yeah.
How do you focus yourself? Like every entrepreneur, it's their job to kind of see all the applications of their technology. And in very old school, it's the job of the VC to be that idiot who says, focus on one thing.
Yeah.
And then now it's 2021. Let's raise so much funding we can plug into everything.
Yeah.
Instead of being a point solution company. But like I remember we've talked about you should be able to sit in your car and speak to the car and say, what kind of oil should I put in it with this temperature? Or just be inside of a large manufacturing company and ask it complicated questions, right? And get these answers back, or law firms and all that.
Yep.
How have you approached the challenge of which industry to focus on first? And even you're running an expensive company, so you kind of sometimes need a little bit of customer traction to show the VCs. And I'll let you answer a question finally, but to give it short, like you can land and expand with one company and probably go forever, or you could collect some logos that probably, impress the unsophisticated, jokingly worthless roadkill venture capitalists. What's your, so how do you choose on focus versus try to be in too many places at once?
Yeah, well, from a product perspective, we're building horizontally, but from a go-to-market perspective, we're going to market vertically. And so we aspire to have countless use cases across countless industries, and we're building in a way that would enable that in a very quick way once we open it up to folks. Finding the right industries to go after, it's a little bit of luck and it's a little bit of customer development, right? Like you go out and talk to folks, and you just put in the work. I had some ideas of where this could go. Military intelligence, which is some work that I did prior to founding Kyndi. Finance. The one that I did not anticipate, but I put the work in on, was manufacturing. And so, we ended up getting a lot of inbound from manufacturing firms. And so I explored, did a bunch of customer development with large manufacturing firms. And it turns out that was one of the fastest sales cycles and the biggest value points that we could deliver. And when I thought about it, it starts to make sense when you kind of sit back, because when you look at AI today, a lot of it is being used for cost savings, so drive efficiencies. There's a lot of folks that try to tie to top line, revenue growth. That's the ultimate value that you could deliver to an enterprise. But I think a lot of AI companies are like loosely tied to revenue growth. Most of them are tied to, hey, clean up OpEx, right? And the reason why I say that is because if you look at manufacturing companies, if you read their 10Ks, their goal is to grow revenue 4 to 5% a year. Like that's not fast at all, right? Because a lot of these companies are 100-year-old companies. And so the only way for the CEO to really drive shareholder value and to increase the stock price is to have margin expansion. And so he or she is sitting there saying, all right, how do I clean up OpEx? How do I get the most for the limited revenue growth that I'm seeing? And I think the manufacturing companies were one of the earliest ones in digital transformation. And so, picking some low-hanging fruit in the digital transformation space, and now they've gotten value out of it, and they're kind of going higher up the tree, doing more sophisticated things with natural language processing, computer vision, robotics. And so, when you actually started to unpack, why are we seeing, the biggest success in manufacturing, it kind of made sense sitting back and looking at it. But it took a lot of work, and it took customer discovery and just doing startup stuff to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, this, but I ran Europe for a company called Motive Communications when broadband was just coming out. The average person made 12 phone calls to the call center saying, my email's not working, the modem, I can't see the internet. And 12 phone calls at $40 a call is kind of expensive.
Yep.
After you ship them a modem that you paid for. Sending a man in a van with a truck roll is the ultimate customer support. The whole thing was brutally expensive. And so we had software that would deflect all these calls by like fixing it, because like 90% of the calls were the same 12 things.
Yep.
So we just wrote some code to fix those 12 things. And we IPO'd that company on the NASDAQ and did really well. So that was 100% just in customer support.
Yep.
But back then we were saying profitability, this is the telco equation, equals the number of users
Yep.
times average revenue per user, ARPU minus ACPU, average cost per user. So Kyndi could probably go into any large business and figure out how to, enhance the customer experience, lower churn, perhaps increase customer acquisition because now you're the better one.
Yep.
And collapse ARPU minus ACPU and, and have a better business. I mean, we got $50 million in one software license for 3 years out of British Telecom. That was the thing. Like I was flying in the front of the airplane. It was great.
Yeah, that's not bad. That's not bad.
Yeah. But like, I think, so how do you think about land and expand versus collecting logos? And then let's tie that to your perception of the venture community, which you can think of the venture community to some extent as fairly ignorant compared to the guy, in the trenches like you.
Yeah. Well, a few questions there, and I wanted to jump on the VC one first.
Yeah.
Well, one, I think venture capitalists are incredibly intelligent.
Okay.
incredibly intelligent people. But you're right; they don't know the details of a business like the CEO knows the details of a business, and candidly, they shouldn't. Like the CEO should know the business the best. And so what's interesting, so I've gathered a bunch of data recently, probably within the last year, and it turns out, and I gathered data on machine learning platforms, NLP platforms, computer vision platforms, and it turns out that on average, the unicorn ML platform companies spend 25 million to get to 1 million ARR.
Okay.
On average. So these are the unicorns. And that's compared to probably if you're a good SaaS company getting to 1 million ARR and 1 million seed. Right? Like if you're an efficient SaaS company, maybe you raise a $3 million round. And I just read somewhere the other day that seeds are now up to like $4.5, $5 million. But you better be getting to 1 million, 2 million, 3 million ARR on that capital. And that's, what's kind of interesting about that, that data is just showed like, I think there is a mismatch in the VC understanding of what it takes to actually build AI companies and AI platform companies. And so these companies show up with $25, $30 million raise, looking like they're a company that should have just raised a seed, right? And so there's this mismatch because VCs have had a lot of success investing in SaaS companies, putting a little bit of money in, getting the unit economics working, and then just funding the growth of that thing and IPOing it at 100 million and getting multiple times their money back. And whereas like AI companies are showing up saying, hey, I believe I have a significantly larger TAM than a SaaS company. However, it's going to take me 30 million bucks to get to 1 million ARR. And that's just, VCs don't have a lot of appetite for that because you look inefficient. You look like you're not executing when in fact you're executing perfectly. Because what you see after you get there is this kick up in this exponential growth. And hey, I have the referenceability from enterprise customers. The technology works. And anyone else that actually wants to come do this, they got to put in that work. And the defensibility is I think much greater, which then goes back to your first question about logos. And I think it's important to expand customers, but it's also important to acquire a critical mass of customers. And so you could have like one large manufacturing company that pays you several $1 million a year, and you grew that from $100,000 a year, and now they're paying you a few million. Like that's great. I think to validate product market fit, you need to, if you're a 100K ACV company, you probably need 20 logos to really validate that you have a product market fit. And so it is a where do you spend your time kind of thing. But I think you need to do both. You need to have a good critical mass of referenceable customers, but you also need to put in that time to grow 100K deal or a 200 or 300K deal into a $1 million, $2 million, $3 million deal.
I also think that going after some different logos is like strategy 101 of what are your resources and capabilities compared to the competition. The fact that you guys can drop and begin to function within hours compared to 6-9 months of this labeling training nonsense, that can enable you to diversify your customer base a little bit, and then also lead towards, I think that you guys, it's a tech company, but I almost reminds me of some of my biotech experience, where in biotech these days that companies raising 30 million for the next phase of clinical trials, they often do a strategic partnering deal with somebody to say, okay, Novartis, you've got exclusivity for Europe or Japan if this thing works. So if this thing's better than Viagra, you've got exclusivity in Japan, and that's got a real like DCF, understandable value. And do you think that, and by diversifying to different industries and not just riding manufacturing all the way to the bank, do you think there's potential for multiple exits and some kind of exclusive licensing deals?
Well, I do think there's multiple exits for this company. It's not just a big tech company coming in, buying you out and adding you to their product portfolio.
So it would be limiting. It could be limiting if you just sold to one list of people that would love to buy you. It could be limiting.
Absolutely. There are multiple ways to exit this company, and I consider all of them for the best outcome for shareholders. And kind of speaking on what you're saying on the tying it to biotech, I think that's interesting. And I think there's what's interesting about it is a lot of the big public cloud infrastructure folks, what really drives their stock price is cloud market share. So if you look at Azure, AWS, I mean Google's Google, where they have this tremendous search business, but if they report to Wall Street that Google Cloud is growing in market share, that just blows it out even more. And I bring that up because in the AI space, everyone's doing the same thing. And so a lot of these techniques were invented in academia, published in the research, then smart folks then take that research and apply them to specific problems. And so on all these platforms, you're going to have the same machine learning techniques, the same AI techniques across all of them. And so what's the reason for me to go to Azure over AWS over Google Cloud? And when they all have the same techniques and the infrastructure is all commodity, and there's really no differentiation. And so with a company like ours, we took a different technique where we said, hey, there's some of these techniques coming out of academia are actually not sufficient for the business problems and markets that we're going after. And so specifically for understanding long form text and specifically for selling into enterprises. And so we invented a new technique that no one else has. And I bring that up because I think there are opportunities with the big public cloud players where it's like, hey, this is a differentiator if you have exclusivity in North America or in Europe. All right, Kyndi on Azure, Kyndi on AWS. You now have a new technique that another cloud infrastructure company doesn't have. And so why should I come to your cloud versus someone else's? Well, because you have this completely different and differentiated AI technique. And I think they're, tying it back to the biotech thing, I think there's an interesting opportunity there with different partnerships to because it does take a lot of money to go to market with this stuff. Could you partner in a way that leverages the resources of the larger players and the go to market and the accessibility to large enterprises with the limited resources that we have here at Kyndi?
It reminds me a little bit of the semiconductors. You need 50 million to make the product and get your first drop of revenue, 25 million to market it. And then in the hands of the acquirer, it's worth so much more than if you tried to be a standalone company and grow it forever. So closing questions. Last week at our Halloween party in Silicon Valley, some guy invited me to this Elon Musk event on some island where we were going to debate how to stop AI from making the human race extinct. And I was like, come on. I was like, but what do you think? Do you ever get that debate of like, all truck drivers being automated with self-driving cars, India's offshore support economy being eaten by software and automated? Where do you stand on it? And I think I can imagine what you're going to say, but
Yeah, I've said this for a few years now on the kind of automation, and people talk about the United States obviously because we're here, but I think India and other locations is really the canary in the coal mine on automation and its impact to employment and its impact to like large swaths of people that do that work. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that changes. I mean, if you look at the RPA space, one of the benefits of RPA, robotic process automation, was you no longer need to send your data to a low wage country to have it taken out of this application and put into this other application. You can now use a bot, and you could still be in lower Manhattan if you're a financial institution doing it. And so I keep an eye on these low wage countries to see how it's going to impact humanity, and then ultimately what happens. One thing about the like taking over the human race and things like that. One thing I found with super intelligent people, and I consider Elon to be a super intelligent person. One of my a few of my founders are that level of intelligent. One of the things that I've found is that they think on different timeframes than a lot of us, right? Like I would have, with my technical co-founder, he would say, "Oh, it's done. You could basically go out and sell it to places right now." And it was still 5 years away from actually being done. like the hardest problem that people have been working on for 70 years. Well, I just solved. So basically it's done. Well, no, there's the productization of it. There's the go-to-market of it. Who's actually going to use it for what purposes? What are the benefits that you're providing to them? There's all of that work. But I think super intelligent people think on, and specifically builders, think on different timeframes. And so when I hear the debate of is AI going to, just wipe us off, all of us off the face of the earth, I think we're thinking about it in the next 3 to 5, maybe 5 to 10 years, and they're thinking about it in like 100 to 200 years, which to them is kind of like 3 to 5 years out. I've just found this like mismatch in time intervals with normal people and the top 0.1% of the intellectual folks out there.
I kind of think of like people saying, well, we'll be able to close the patent office in a couple of years because everything will have been invented by then. Or when computers are doing this many transactions per second, we won't have to work anymore, and we'll have to deal with like, we're all rich Saudis. What do we do now? And like Zoom happened or the COVID came, and you're like, wow, I don't have to waste my time flying to Hong Kong or whatever. And we somehow, if you're late for 1 minute on a Zoom, people are like, what's wrong with you? So it seems like we almost work more. So I tend to think if you enable someone who was reading clinical trial data and all day long, and now they're using Kyndi to do it, they're free to do something more interesting. Like when you were spending time after 2008 looking for whatever details you needed to extract, you could have been doing something very valuable to the firm, and they wouldn't have, shit canned you because you're no longer doing this grunt work that you were overeducated to be doing to begin with. So I kind of think if you had all your accounting work done in India and you digitize that, these people can move over to cyber and look at computer screens all day and deal with cyber or whatever else we need done. But what do you think the impact on the economy is in general of what I view as progress on digitizing industries?
Yeah, I think it's progress as well. And I believe it'll show up in the economic data, productivity data, GDP, and all of that. And hopefully it shows up in kind of the happiness data as well, because I do think there's an argument a pretty good one where it's if you drive all this productivity and you think about, hey, why do we work? Well, we work to acquire certain things and kind of move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And it's like, hey, do I have this foundation covered? And so like, if you can actually, if people lose work or their job, but the costs of goods that they need to purchase is so low because they're produced in such a low cost way with machines, then are they worse off or are they better off? Like that's an interesting question, right? Where it's like, hey, I now don't have a job. Maybe, universal basic income or some form of it, gets me what I need, and everything I need to buy is a penny.
Well, I think
it's an interesting, intellectual debate that we're now having, but I do think there is an argument, and I think Sam Altman made this argument for OpenAI, and that was one of the first times where I think I heard Sam and I was like, all right, I actually kind of agree with what you're saying there, and I think it was a really interesting way to talk about it.
Well, I would say quickly that work is part of finding purpose in your life.
Yes.
And if your work is attaching a bolt onto a tire in a Ford Motor Company assembly line, that's not the greatest purpose in life. And those same people could do something that's more meaningful to them in work and find their purpose. And I think that all this software is perhaps putting people on a better path.
Yeah, and there's interesting ways to think about that too, because some people would say, you're right, putting a bolt into this spot is not the best thing that I could be doing, but what fulfills me is doing something to the best of my ability, right? And and it's just kind of like, hey, this is my job, I'm going to do it to the best of my ability, regardless of what it is. And if I come in and I do that to the best of my ability, it doesn't matter what the job is, I actually feel fulfilled because I'm getting a paycheck, I'm able to spend time with my family, and I do the best best work that I can do, and I feel fulfilled by that. So these are definitely interesting debates on what it means to be fulfilled, what is happiness, and then how do we measure the impact of technology? Is it a purely economic measurement, or is there the happiness measurements that people have been talking about?
I think we should put a lot more focus on the happiness. Final question, I'll let you go. What are you optimistic about in this? The news cycle is always doom and gloom. What are you optimistic about?
With AI specifically, or with my business, or just optimistic just in general?
In general.
Yeah. Honestly, it's quite hard to be optimistic after 20 months of a lockdown. But let me say this. For my business, what we're seeing is this acceleration with the adoption of natural language processing. And so I kind of think about the 2000s were about becoming a big data enabled enterprise. The 2010s were about becoming a data science enabled enterprise. So like applying more sophisticated statistics, which is machine learning, to structured numerical data, so columns and rows. And then what we're seeing is this evolution beyond that now, because we see unicorns in the data science platform space. And I think we've been seeing this uptick in interest in solving long-standing NLP problems, unstructured text problems within the enterprise. So one of the things that gets me optimistic and gets me excited about continuing to build this business is we had a wave with AI, as a major technology trend, probably starting 2012, 2013, but like specifically delivering business value. I think we've seen this uptick in the adoption of NLP in the last year or two. And I think that's just going to accelerate even further. And so I think there's an opportunity for someone to build a really large business being the platform for the natural language enabled enterprise. And that's going to occupy a new spot in the modern data infrastructure for enterprises.
Well, I'm optimistic that people are going to recognize that they need this when they maybe didn't recognize that the way they were doing it was not sufficient. But Ryan, thank you so much. Speak to you soon in the real world.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, bye for now.